كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم. أما بعد. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome back to another term in which we are delving into various aspects of the Hanafi madhab in terms of history, evidences, structure, etc., etc. And although we're not doing a absolute chronological study in terms of from the beginning to the end, which I don't think is the most useful, we are trying to focus in on certain aspects that seem to be much more, which are seen to be pertinent in the development of a more robust understanding of the madhab. Now, in this term, we'll be doing, we'll be kind of taking a bit more of a deeper dive in some of the topics that we had briefly covered in the first term. And we'll also be doing a brief introduction into the other three madhabs. And I do emphasize the point that it's a brief introduction that we're looking to do, not claiming any deep dive, because not claiming any great expertise. But there are a number of benefits and needs for why a person should be having at least some basic awareness of how other madhabs, a basic understanding of its structures, unique features and overlaps with one's own madhab. Two main things kind of stand out in terms of the benefit of doing such a study. Number one is the fact that it is part of our Sunni fiqh tradition. So a person who is unaware or has absolutely no knowledge of the other fiqhi traditions, fiqhi madahib, then in essence that is approximately 3/4 of our fiqh tradition that a person is unaware of. And on on a more practical basis, you would say that we did speak about last term some of the times in which it was permissible, what is known as ifta ala madhab al-ghayr, the permissibility to give fatwa on another madhab. And fatwa on another madhab can be given based upon can be given in two ways. One is to simply ask a scholar of another madhab and they give the answer and you can present it, which is probably the more safer option. And number two is that you analyze it yourself. But that being said, although we do agree that the first method is probably safer, but there have been times, even though I can say on more of a personal level, where one person has asked a person of a different madhab saying what is the position of the madhab, and what they have provided is incorrect, not actually the position of the madhab. So that doesn't mean that a person starts to distrust everyone, but at least a basic understanding of the structure of other madahib would allow one to save oneself from at least major errors. So you'll be able to say, can you please give us a citation, and at least we have some awareness of citation of certain figures, that when we hear those names we can say this is coinciding with the brief understanding that we do have of the madhabs. But for today's session, what we're going to be discussing, because this does open the door to a discussion that is oft-had over the last few decades, which is known as fiqh al-muqaran, which is also known as comparative fiqh. So we'll be discussing this session, comparative fiqh, and then we will start to delve into a few other topics, inshallah. So right, so with that introduction out the way, we can kind of move on to a bit more to kind of delve into this topic about fiqh al-muqaran, which is we're translating as comparative fiqh. Now, the claim of today's session is going to be that fiqh al-muqaran, as I will define it, is very much a modern phenomena. But before we can explain this modern phenomena, because we are going to be looking briefly at the madhabs, but we're not going to be doing fiqh al-muqaran, and I'll explain the distinction, because linguistically, the linguistic term of doing comparative fiqh, then any large fiqh book does comparative fiqh. So if you were to open up Al-Hidayah of Imam Marghinani, there is comparative fiqh. He will say, this is what we say, this is what Shafi'i says. If you were to go and look into Ibn Abdul Barz, At-Tamheed, right, or Ibn Qudam al-Maqdisi's Al-Mughni, any of these larger fiqh works, you see a number of them will engage in comparative fiqh. So what do I mean by that fact that fiqh al-muqaran, comparative fiqh, is a modern or is largely a modern phenomena? So let's try to break this down, inshallah. And in doing so, we will start to highlight a bit more regarding what is known as modernist fiqh, and then we can kind of delve into the topic of Salafi fiqh as well, as epitomized by individuals such as Sheikh Nasiruddin al-Albani rahimahullah. So the classical form of fiqh al-muqaran, if you want to use that term, of comparative fiqh, usually took the following model. A person who was taught and studied and gained a level of expertise in a single madhab. Now, there are examples of people who may have gained expertise in a wider array of in more than one madhabs. That is also true as well for scholars like Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. But generally speaking, the training of an individual will be of a single madhab, and that's where you will try to gain some form of expertise in. And then you will write works, books, in which you will elaborate upon your madhab. You might provide evidences for your madhab, and then you'll compare it with what other madhahib have said. And in many instances, when the comparison is made with other madhahib, you will generally try to prove why your madhab is correct. That's the idea, that's your training, that's what you've learned. And of course, there were scholars of higher caliber who performed some level of ijtihad, so they would even, in many instances, depending on who the scholar is, may prefer positions from other madhabs over and above the positions of their own madhab. So that's a phenomena, and that's a reality that's there. But the basic structure that you have an individual of a single madhab who's trained in that madhab is then engaging or describing phenomena in other madhahib, or what's happening in other madhabs, and comparing that. That's a phenomena, or you can call a fiqh al-muqaran, a comparative fiqh, which existed in pre-modern times and is very much part and parcel of our tradition. Right, and then also part and parcel of that tradition is that some of these scholars will do tarjih, they will give preference to other madhabs over and above your own madhab. A very famous individual within the Hanafi madhab who was known to have done this was Ibn Humam. Ibn Humam was one such imam who had spent considerable amount of his life defending and arguing for the Hanafi madhab. But if you look at his commentary, Fathul Qadir, you'll find that in numerous places in Fathul Qadir, he gives preferences to other madhabs over and above the Hanafi madhab. And it was something that was significant enough for his student Qasim bin Qutlubugha to even point out that one must be careful of his teachers Ibn Humam's isolated positions, because he would do ijtihad, he would do tarjih sometimes outside the madahib. Later on, and it's hard to say how wide a phenomena this was in the past, but I'm trying to break this down, is that in the last century and a half, you do find a number of Hanafi scholars who do a lot of tarjih outside the madhab and prefer certain positions. We highlighted some of this in the last term, but whether that's the product of more things being available, or whether it's there's just a wider need or a wider permissibility or permission, because you're not bound by being qadis of your given madhab, that you given more freedom, it's hard to say, because what we have normally of the ulama of the past are fiqh books, not necessarily specific edicts, although we do have that specific fatwa that have been collected, but these are specific. Predominantly the books that we have are fiqh books, right, where you sometimes highlight the fatwa of some earlier scholars, but generally speaking these are fiqh books. So when we have something like Fatawa Hindiya is not a collection of fatwa by Indian scholars, right? And that's something that some people can be deceived by, because of the title Fatawa Hindiya. You assume that will just be fatwa given by Indian scholars. That's not what you get in Fatawa Hindiya, right? Fatawa Tatar Khaniya, right, written by Allama Indarpati, right? Tatar Khan was the leader that he wrote the work for. Fatawa Tatar Khaniya, again, is not a book which is a bunch of fatwa written by Indarpati. Rather, it's a collection of, rather it's a book of fiqh in which maybe odd fatwa mentioned. The reason why they're called fatwa such and such, fatwa such and such, is because they are recording, or two ways. One is that because many of them they record some earlier fatwa, and other places these are a place where a mufti can use the source to give fatwa from. This is in contrast to when we look at contemporary works, when we say, let's say, the Urdu Fatawa collection. So you have Fatawa Mahmudiyya, Fatawa Dawlum Doband, Fatawa, or even Ahmad Raza Khan's Fatawa Ridawiyya. Then these collections are actual fatawa. Predominantly, there are actual questions that are asked by real people, and then real answers given to in response to that, rather than a wider book in which can be seen as like a generic fatwa. These are actually very much more specific fatawa. So anyway, that's just a point to note. I just added that in there. How much of a wider phenomena that is, Allah Ta'ala knows best. That probably requires a much more of a thorough study of earlier actual fatawa works, or fatawa, rather than fiqh text, or at least the fatawa within fiqh text. Right. Now, when we are talking about fiqh al-muqaran in the modern era, I'm just going to try to define the term here, and then we'll kind of move on to a bit more specifics. Fiqh al-muqaran, the way fiqh is studied, you see this is mentioned and complained by scholars like Sheikh Salah al-Hajj and others, that in the Arab world, now we don't really have this much of this as much of a phenomena within traditional madaris within the subcontinent, or at least the Hanafi madaris or madrasas. They're very clear they're Hanafi, and therefore when you go into a Hanafi madrasa, you study Hanafi fiqh. Right, you go through your a mukhtasar text or two, then you go through like a commentary, then something like Hidayah, and then you have an iftar course, and then you go into more larger works, and therefore you try to gain some sort of competency within the specific madhab, in this case the Hanafi madhab. A lot of these universities, especially when we look at universities like Medina University, where people go and study fiqh, they wouldn't necessarily go and study a madhab specifically, rather they'll have a comparative madhab lesson. So they may be looking at books such as Bidayatul Mujtahid. Now, I'm not speaking as someone who's an insider here, because this is not how I learned fiqh, but I have seen this phenomena, and I've seen people comment about this phenomena, which you study something like Bidayatul Mujtahid, and there's a number of other works out there which may not be studied, but they may be, in class, but they may be used as resources, such as Al-Fiqh al-Islam wa Adillatuhu by the late Sheikh Wahab al-Zuhaili, rahimahullah. You got Fiqh al-Madhab al-Arba'a by al-Jazairi, rahimahullah, and so on and so forth. These kind of texts are out there, which allow the student to go through and find out what the other madhabs have said, and even provide evidences for those madhabs. It sounds like a very useful way to do fiqh, right? It sounds like a very compelling way to do fiqh. The fact that you learn what all the four madhabs have said, you learn their evidences, and then you even at the end, you're kind of forced to do a tarjih. So if you're doing, let's say, Kitab al-Salah, and if I'm teaching Kitab al-Salah like this, then it's not possible for me to, at the end of Kitab al-Salah, or end of a mas'ala, for example, let's say we're doing a mas'ala on Sajdu Sahu, and I say, the Hanafi says this, and this is the evidences, the Shafi says this is the evidences, and so on and so forth. At the end of the lesson, or at the end of that subject, that topic, a student would naturally ask that what's the correct position. And it will be very likely that if this is how I'm teaching it, I'll be forced to either do one or two things. One is to do to give my own personal tarjih and say, well, over here I think the Shafi'is have a stronger form of evidence. Now, students in that case will be bound, because the students, they don't have the competency to do tarjih. They become bound to the tarjih of me if I am that teacher, and so therefore you may go back and say you're following dalil, but what ends up happening is that you are following the tarjih of your teacher. So I've already mentioned a small critique of it, but this is what we are referring to by the study of fiqh al-muqaran. And anyway, we're going to explore a few other aspects of this, inshallah. Right, so that kind of explains some of the I've kind of defined what I mean by contemporary fiqh al-muqaran. And so just to kind of elaborate a bit on that critique, right near the end is where, and to elaborate on why, to elaborate on the critique, is that The reason why this is problematic as a method of study, so although it might sound very appealing, you can imagine having a discussion with students of knowledge and saying to them, well, or people who are aspiring students of knowledge saying, would it not be great if you can just see what the four madhabs have said? Or why four? Why Awza'i, what Sufyan al-Thawri, Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, what they've got to say, and then just kind of see what is in accordance with the dalil, have it in front of you, make a decision. Isn't that a great way to learn fiqh? Now, there's a whole host of problems with this. I'm going to try to spend this segment of elaborating upon that, inshallah, and then also explain how this notion of modernism in the last segment, how it applies to this discussion, inshallah. Right. So why is this a problem? Right? Why is this a problem? The way we study the way a student in any field, for that matter. So if you kind of think about how you study in what you say high school, or the way you study science or mathematics, or you study anything. As a person going into a new field, you are originally dictated facts, figures, statistics, rules, depending on whatever the science is. So it's dictated to you, say that, well, in science, this is the rule and therefore this is correct. In science, scientists have said X, Y, and Z, and you kind of work off those premises. If you start off the lesson by highlighting all the various positions held on a given topic, that may be useful for having a good overview, but it's going to be very difficult for a person to start off because they don't have a school of thought to start off with. You're starting off with the premise of anyone being exposed to all of these opinions, so there is no training on any given set method, so nor do you gain competency in a set method. Now, when it comes down to the Islamic sciences and you're studying fiqh, why is this a major problem? Because when you are starting off learning jurisprudence or fiqh, and the first thing you are exposed to is khilaf, is difference of opinion, and then not just difference of opinion, you're exposed to evidences as well of why a certain scholar or scholars or madhabs have said what they've got to say. There's a number of shortcomings. Number one, let's assume that the evidences that you have been provided are the actual evidences of that madhab. The position you've been provided is actually the position of the madhab. Let's assume those, let's work off those assumptions. The problem that you have is that as a beginner student of knowledge, which would be the time where you'll be studying fiqh al-muqaran, there would be a person would not have the skills required to determine which position is more correct. So when you are doing tarjih, you're giving preference. The tarjih of a muqallid has no weight. Rather, it can be very detrimental because you'll be doing preferences based upon without any solid grounding in anything. So you will be highly inconsistent. So the tarjih of the muqallid, the preference of a person who is basing his level of knowledge is taqleed, is highly problematic, and you wouldn't accept it in any other field. Furthermore, and this is where you can get to a bit more of the problem with so one is, of course, the individual doing it. The other problem that you have is a lot of these books that are written, and I'll come back to why these books can be very useful. So I'm not dismissing these books like by Sheikh Wahb Zuhail rahimahullah and all these other works. I'm not dismissing these works, not at all, but it's just to highlight its position or when to use it. So as a beginner, the first issue you have is, if this is how you're studying fiqh, how do you know that the position that you are ascribing or is being the position that is being ascribed to the given madhab is the accurate position of that madhab? Right? Is the accurate position of that madhab. So therefore, the first problem you have is, because you don't have any skills in a specific madhab to try to determine what the correct position is in that in a given madhab, you don't have the skills to do any of that, and you don't have anything to go back on because you have no training in any madhab. And just to kind of highlight why this is not a caricature that we are creating. There's many students of knowledge that have gone and studied fiqh like this, and after a decade later, you see them come back and say, you know what, I need to adopt a madhab and learn via the method of a madhab, because they have no solid grounding of where to work off. What's your default positions? Because you can't be doing tarjih in everything. Even they'll realize that, even if they assume they could do tarjih in some. That's number one. Number two is that the evidences that are provided in these books, how do we know, again, assuming that the positions are accurate, that these are the evidences that are being provided? Right? How do we know that the positions that are being provided, the evidence which are providing, are the evidences that are provided in the madhab? Because there could be further arguments, debate, principles which have not been highlighted or have not been understood. So therefore, when you're doing tarjih, one of the rules of doing tarjih will be that you have presented a accurate presentation of the view and evidences of a given position. Once you have been given the accurate view and evidences of given positions, then assuming you got the competency, you can go and do the tarjih. But if you don't have the initial, knowledge whether the position or the evidences are what is being claimed, then you should know that you are working off a very shaky grounds for this approach to this process of fiqh. Now, I can give you one example, just to highlight that there are masail in the Hanafi madhab where some of the Hanafi scholars, they have mentioned that the reason why we have not adopted a specific hadith is because of the narrator of the hadith. The Sahabi who's narrating the hadith is not considered to be a jurist, a faqih. And I have had people mention this, saying that look, if this is your evidence that you don't consider the Sahabi as a faqih like Abu Huraira, and you are denying this hadith, that's a weak usul. So it's very easy for us to turn around and say that the Hanafi evidence in this given issue is weak because they're based upon a weak usul, that they consider Abu Huraira as not being a jurist. Therefore, if his position goes against analogy or qiyas in a more broader sense, then we would dismiss the position of Abu Huraira and accept analogy or qiyas. And they will say, well, this is a stronger principle. The problem here is that the evidence that you've been exposed to by the Hanafi madhab, we can say with certainty, whatever masla is, which is based upon the fact that the Sahaba is a jurist or not, none of that is from Imam Abu Hanifa. Right? That form of evidence, whether you believe it's strong or weak, it is not from Imam Abu Hanifa. It is later Hanafis who have provided that as an evidence. And there are Hanafi usulis that do not consider that usul. So on that given issue that you think that the Hanafis use as an evidence, these other Hanafis would have used alternative evidences. So in a book or in a dars, you may be provided such, saying that the Hanafi say this because of this usul, and this usul is weak, and you may turn around and say, I agree that it's weak. But now you have not been provided the full picture. So because you have not been provided the full picture, your tarjih that you're claiming to do is based upon erroneous grounds, which is not which is you've been given only part of the picture. And there's a number of things I can say, but just to kind of highlight one last point of critique is that, and then the next section I'll tell you some of the benefits of it, of these books, is that because fiqh itself is such a massive undertaking, that if your first exposure to a topic is trying to understand these range of differences, I'm just talking about now from a practical perspective of learning fiqh, then you really get exposed to an information overload. So let's say someone says, you know what, the attribution, the evidences, I'm going to look quite wide, no problem. So let's start, if you're a student of knowledge and you're starting learning, or your second book you're learning, you're doing a book like Bidayat al-Mujtahid, and so each mas'ala, you're going to go back to Hanafi sources, you're going to go back to Shafi'i sources, Maliki sources, Hanbali sources. You're going to look at the ikhtilaf within the madhab and what the rajih of a given madhab is. And then you're going to look at the evidences. So let's say in the Hanafi madhab, you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to check out what Bada' Sana'at says, I'm going to check out what Mabsur Sarakhsi says, I'm going to check out what Al-Aini said, Ibn Humam said, I'm going to go check up I'la Sunan, I'm going to check up this. And then I'm going to do the same for the Mal. It's going to be very hard for you to go through the first year of just covering Kitab al-Tahara, because the content will be so much, it's not possible to learn. Right? So these are quite, I would say, strong arguments against the way of doing fiqh via the lens of al-fiqh al-muqaran, where, as I mentioned in the previous section, you would be, in essence, at the, what ends up becoming is you become at the mercy of your teacher. So although you may be perceiving to do fiqh, to do tarjih, follow dalil, in actual fact you're following the dalil that your teacher is providing you. So for example, I don't know the level of people are listening here, but let's say this is the first time you've been approached to fiqh. Naturally, because I have been doing fiqh for a decade, right? I've been learning Islamic sciences. I'm not praising myself. I'm just saying is that if I've been doing it for so long and this is your first few months into it, I can convince you whatever I want. Right? I can make whatever evidences I want, and it'll be very easy to convince you because there wouldn't be anything you can check them by. Right? There'll be no background to check it by. So at the end of the lesson, if I'm teaching you dalil, it's not actually dalil. At the end of it, you're following me, my formation of the dalil. Right? And likewise, if I was in a lesson of someone who's doing an expert of Arabic language, of adab, I'm not an expert in adab. I don't sit there my spare time reading about the khilaf of the nahwis and of the nahwis. So if I'm in a lesson, someone says, I'm going to give you the dalil and tarjih, I'm at the mercy of this nahwi teacher. Whatever they teach me the dalil is and rajih is, I would most likely follow it because I don't have a background to go back and say this is right or wrong. So that's just the point that we're trying to highlight. And in the last segment, we will try to explain some of that, or where the rightful place of these books are, because we're not dismissing these books out. Okay, so that hopefully explains some of the critique of this method of studying fiqh, which is known as fiqh al-muqaran, and some of the shortcomings. Now, does that mean that there is a dismissal of these very large and very impressive works? I mentioned a couple just right now: fiqh al-Islam wa dillatuhu, fiqh al-Madal al-Arba'a. You even got Mawsu'atul Fiqhiyya Kuwaitiyya, this is a 40-volume work, a very, very impressive works. Am I saying that these works are useless and we should not approach them? No, to the contrary. To the contrary, these books are very useful and should be utilized, should be read, should be studied. The point that we are trying to highlight here, or I'm trying to highlight at least, is that the process for a student who's studying fiqh, the fiqh al-muqaran, assuming that that's how you begin your fiqh journey, well, that's not been the traditional way of learning fiqh, and nor is it. So one is you've got traditions, you've got precedent, so you can look back and say, because there is a precedent for this, there is a good case to suggest that this is the right way. And then we can also rationalize a precedent and say, well, let's look at why the precedent is there, and have they presented a good case to do fiqh that way? And I think on both cases your answer will be yes and yes. So is there a precedent? As I mentioned before, that the way of studying fiqh before was that you have your journey within a madhab, you build up some level of competency and awareness of the madhab, the khilaf in the madhab, tabaqat in the madhab, what the rajih is, how the madhab operates, what we can also refer to as the flavor of a given madhab in terms of the method it approaches, adilla, etc., etc. And once a person gains some form of competency within that, then comes the journey of trying to. So before that, the muqaran fiqh that you get, for example, in some of fiqh texts, that's not actual fiqh al-muqaran. That's providing the other view to usually respond to. So when you look at hidayah, you won't call that a comparative fiqh within as an objective sense. It's basically the Hanafi view is correct. This is what the Shafi'i say, and this is why they are incorrect. Or in odd cases, what Malik says. So that's not considered fiqh al-muqaran in the strict sense, because you are not interested so much in the other opinion. You're interested in trying to highlight why the Hanafi position, the rationale for its justification. But once a person goes past those stages and they are engaged in the field of ifta or answering questions, etc., then, as you will see in the next few sessions, it is not easy to gain expertise in every given madhab and to be thoroughly well read in all of these texts and how to give an accurate presentation of each madhab on every given issue. So in those cases, as a guide, as a help to see what other madhabs have said and to get a general idea of how or what the evidences are for any given madhab, then these books that do a comparative fiqh, right, a fiqh al-muqaran, they become a very useful and usually contemporary text, because historically a lot of these comparative fiqh texts are mentioned through the lens of a given madhab. So as I mentioned, Bidayat al-Mujtahid might be a bit of a difference to that, but if you're going to look at Al-Mughni of Ibn Qudama, then although that you can cite them, Ibn Dabbar, you can cite that. You see scholars cite saying that if you want to see what the madhahib have said, they will sometimes just cite Mughni and his conclusion or his summary of the different madhahib. Nailul Awtar of Imam al-Shawkani, people cite that to say this is what the other madhahib have said. But these contemporary texts, which are many a times considered much more meticulous in their citation of the different positions, are very useful for a person to get a summary or an idea what the other scholars have said. Again, this doesn't mean that the person, as a research tool, so if you're looking to do thorough research, and the way to do thorough research is to actually engage with the text of those madhabs, get guidance and go through them. But if you're trying to get a general idea what the other madhahib have said, or to understand what the other positions out there are, then these books of contemporary of fiqh al-muqaran, comparative fiqh, are actually very useful for that endeavor. Right? So the Fiqh al-Islam wa Adillatuhu of Shaykh Wahb al-Zuhaili, if I am interested in finding out what is the Maliki evidence for, I don't know, al-Waqt Mushtarak, or I'm interested in what is the Shafi'i evidence for Hummatul Musahara, or their notion of it, then I can quite easily go to Al-Fiqh al-Islam wa Adillatuhu, open up the relevant section, see what he has cited. So you say that the Shafi'i say X, Y, and Z. You have a basic citation. Or go to Mawsu'a Fiqhiyya Kuwaitiyya and see what has been said regarding this by the Shafi'is. What are the basic references? So I can have that as a base understanding. So if I'm in class or someone asks me, I say, well, in the Shafi'i madhab, this is the general view. Right? That wouldn't be enough for me to give a verdict on it or to give any depth to it, but it's a fair source to have a general idea of what they got to say. This is why if you're going to write an article, you do writing up a research, then to just suffice on this to cite other madhahib would not be considered academically meticulous. But in the class, so if for example we're doing a class and someone says, can you summarize what the various views are of the madhahib on any given issue? And I say, well, in the Mawsu'a, it has said that the Shafi'i and Hanbali say this, the Hanafi say that, or like in the past I can say, Ibn Qudama, he has this passage where he says that, so-and-so scholars say this, so-and-so scholars say that. That's fine in our classes when we are just mentioning a surface level analysis, and it gives you a good general overview of a given case, but so therefore these texts are very useful. But fiqh al-muqaran, as in that's one in terms of the books. But the idea of the science is also very useful, but that comes at a later stage when a person gains some competency, because then you have some sort of anchor to tell you what your fiqh is, what your default understanding is. So for example, I would have positions, if you ask me a question, and I'll say, well, the Hanafi position on this is X, Y, and Z. And that will be my default stance. If I don't know anything to the better, I don't know anything else, I haven't seen any khilaf, I haven't seen any evidence, I haven't seen what people have said to the contrary, my default position is, this is what the Hanafi madhab said. But then that's the importance of that, is because we are anchored in a madhab. Now, as you get more advanced within the stages of the madhab and you become more senior, in assuming that there's a consistent form of study, senior doesn't just mean age, in terms of you being engaged with the madhab for a number of years, decades even, then studying other fiqh or doing comparative fiqh can be very important, because when it actually comes to ifta, many a times the position that your madhab has held may not be the most friendly or the most appropriate to act upon, and other madhab may be more accurate. And then even in terms of ijtihad, for those scholars, you see quite famously amongst the Hanafi school in recent years was someone like Shaykh Yunus rahimahullah, Shaykh Yunus Jaunpuri rahimahullah. Even in masail which are not to do with just haraj upon people, he actually did tarjih. So he looked at evidences of specific positions, whether it's to do with salat, tahara, buyu', whatever, and he said, well, in my opinion, the Shafi'i madhab or the Hanbali whatever madhab is stronger in this case. But that's fine. We may disagree with him, his tarjih, and say I don't agree with what his tarjih is, but the reality is that he's gone through the process of studying a madhab to a competent level, and now he's engaging across the madhahib, and he feels that he has the ability to weigh up the evidences. But the journey starts it starts with a single madhab, and then you go abroad. You can then, depending on how far you go in the journey, you can start to branch out. But if you start off the journey where you're already branched out and you're trying to get to a single conclusion, then that is a very difficult and I would say highly problematic way of doing fiqh. And just to kind of summarize on this, so this is where we talk about, if we ask about what Salafi fiqh is, then actual Salafi fiqh in terms of non-madhab fiqh, where a person studies fiqh without restricting in terms of madhab, is what we are talking about. So that would be actual dalil based fiqh, whether that's the so if you're talking about like someone like Shaykh Albani rahimahullah, Shaykh Albani, he doesn't work off a default madhab. He doesn't say ashabuna. There is no ashabuna. There is no our companions, our madhab. It all starts off from each issue we looked at and then answered in accordance to dalil. That's the type of fiqh of Shaykh Albani. But then that's not, it would be unfair to me to say this is Salafi fiqh in the sense of having a description of what all Salafis do, because you start to notice now that many people who ascribe to Salafiyya do actually have a training in a specific madhab, although their attribution to the madhab may be a bit more looser than how traditionally people ascribe to a given madhab. So that kind of highlights, so a lot of people will be studying, let's say, the Hanbali madhab, and then move into the Hanbali, and then they'll start maybe doing tarjih, maybe too early, and we can critique that and question that. But as long as there's a start of an anchor, somewhere as a default, so you can have like an ashabuna, as we're saying, our companions, our madhab, at least you have that. And then, if someone wants to kind of branch out later, then we can see the competency and challenge that. And usually scholarship itself will decide whether you are competent or not. And what the idea of modernism then, I just want to quickly highlight on this. So modernism works very, although there's not necessarily a strict modernist framework of studying fiqh, but it does work off the premise of taking away the authorities of the madhab. So there is a connection. There is a connection with Salafi fiqh in the sense of doing away with the authority of madahib and modernism, but there is there's usually, if you want to make, there's not strict categories here, but there's a usual distinction in terms of the way we come to answers. So usually Salafi fiqh, if you call someone like Shaykh Albani for example, that the way we come to answers is still embedded within the traditional method of the Sunnah, and utilize the Hadith works and Quran to determine what is correct. So although there's not, the authority of the madhab is gone, but the method is very similar, therefore the positions that are usually derived in fiqh are quite similar to the madahib. Whereas a modernist works with a similar premise, but they don't use a similar methodology as traditional madhahib, so therefore the conclusions tend to be more radical. This is me simplifying categories. Of course, there's a lot of grey areas, but hopefully that kind of highlights some of the pitfalls and or kind of conceptualizes this debate, inshallah. So with that, we conclude this first session on fiqh al-muqaran. And so just to kind of summarize what we've gone through today, is that we first defined what fiqh al-muqaran is, and we made a distinction between pre-modern notions of fiqh al-muqaran, such as the earlier works where they have a person's usually a follower of a madhab and they're exposed to what other madhab have said. And then there's different levels of pre-modern jurists in terms of some of them just are there to defend their own madhab. In other cases, there'll be others that are sympathetic to other madhabs. And in some cases, people that even may be given fatwa on other madhabs. We see that, but probably a bit more rare. And fiqh al-muqaran, as in what I was critiquing today, was a method of how to study fiqh. So when you get students and you enroll them into an institution or into a syllabus, the syllabus begins with the study of a comparative fiqh text like Bidayat al-Mujtahid or some other text like that, or you do usul al-fiqh. Similarly, you do like a comparative usul al-fiqh text, or a person comes and says, I've gone through the different usul texts, so this is the summary of all of that. The method of that, why that is problematic, it does not. It actually becomes it can be a stifler to progress in the field of jurisprudence. So although it sounds quite appealing, it does practically have many shortcomings. Then we also explain the fact that so these books that we then have of comparative fiqh, are they worthless? I say far from being worthless, they're very useful. It's just that you have to consider what they're being used for and at what time in your scholarly journey are you engaging with these books. If that can be tweaked to the right time, as I've highlighted and argued, then these works can be highly useful. So therefore, the traditional method of studying fiqh, which I think is practically the most useful, is that a person studies a single madhab, gains competency, ability within that madhab, understands the structure, evidences, style, etc. And thereafter, once you gain such proficiency, and of course, as you're doing that, you're probably studying what other madhabs say anyway. Then after that, you can start to engage with some of these texts, or even start to read other madhahib, and so you can get a much more broader understanding of fiqh. But that's something more later in the journey, and it can have different reasons why you do that, why you may do that, which I've highlighted already, inshallah. So we also touched upon the figure of Sheikh Albani, not too deep. Maybe in some later sessions I may delve or dabble a bit more deeper into this point of Salafi fiqh, where I see relevant. Not so much just yet. There are some other points that are important, which I think in due course we will highlight, especially when we talk about the notion of إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي, which will come up in a upcoming session, inshallah. So we'll stop here for now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.